morning, everybody. And today we have an interesting talk by our friend Jeffery Smith, whose title is Two Things I Learnt from Nietzsche. Jeffery.
Thank you, friends. I think I'm heard. I hope I'm heard. And I think I'm a co-host. I'll have a little bit of screen sharing at one stage. Well, in fact, I'll do a screen share now if I can, and then I won't need to do it again. I'm just reminding myself how to do that. What view is best for me to have? I wonder, friends. If I'm speaker.
You click on screen share at the bottom, and it doesn't matter about the view because once you've.
All right. Okay. Okay, well, I have a picture of Nietzsche coming up. Let me just clear other things and the Gordy screen. There, hopefully you'll see a picture of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Born 1844 to died 1900. Sorry, I'm the death date. I may have got wrong on that. I'm sorry. Anyway, he died in the 1890s, I think. I will just move that now. You admire the big moustache and things like that. I'll just get myself more comfortable on screen, and it's nice to have a gallery view. So I'm looking at.
Oh, well, first of all, you need to end screen sharing if you want gallery view of everybody.
All right.
That's a green button.
Share. Okay, I've got that. And now I can get onto gallery view. Looks nice. Okay, thank you, friends. Hopefully there won't be any other slips of that sort.
No.
So I'm going to read my talk of 2005 first, and then look back on it. I gave this talk at Walthamstow Meeting House, and about 20 friends attended. I'd put an advert in The Friend, and various friends came from different parts of London, and there were about 20 friends there, not just from my own area meeting. I start with Isaac Pennington in 1653, what used to be the motto to Christian faith and practice. That was the Blue Book. All truth is a shadow except the last, except the utmost. Yet every truth is true in its kind. It is substance in its own place, though it be but a shadow in another place. And the shadow is a true shadow, as the substance is a true substance. For many years, as a liberal-minded Christian, I bent Christianity further and further. But language is for exchange of ideas and experiences with others. It must be true. I decided, therefore, I could no longer call myself a Christian. I did not believe a significant proportion of what most Christians think makes them Christian. On 9/11, mass suicide bombers killed thousands. They thought they would thus enter heaven. But I ask, do not mainstream Christians base this life on a misguided image of an afterlife? I used to think I experienced the love of God. I came to see this good feeling as the afterglow of my mother's love for me when I was a tiny baby. My spiritual life now seemed dead. On one occasion, I had a vision, or was it a dream? I was in outer space. No love was near. Planet Earth was recognizable in the distance. How I wished I was back there. I cried. A few months later, in a bookshop, I came across books by and on Nietzsche. Dipping into some, I thought I was onto something. Nietzsche lived from 1844 to the 1890s, born in Germany to a family of Lutheran priests. He lived most of his life outside Germany, however. His most famous book is Thus Spake Zarathustra. Reading Nietzsche is something of an adventure. He needs reading extensively. Excerpts can be misleading. Some philosophers shun him. He at times sets out to shock the reader. For example, he pronounced God is dead. A book is entitled The Antichrist. Indeed, some of his ideas seem quite outrageous. For example, he thinks pity is bad. One idea of Nietzsche's attracted me especially, that of the various perspectives. I refer to Encyclopedia Britannica here. Nietzsche often thought of his writings as struggles with nihilism, and apart from his critiques of religion, philosophy, and morality, he developed original theses that have commanded attention, especially perspectivism. Perspectivism is a concept which holds that knowledge is always perspectival, that there are no immaculate perceptions, and that knowledge from no point of view is as incoherent a notion as that of seeing from no particular vantage point. Perspectivism also denies the possibility of an all-inclusive perspective, as being as incoherent as the concept of seeing an object from every possible vantage point simultaneously. His ideas of perspectives seem like a development in modern times of Isaac Pennington's finding that truth is true in its own kind. Perspectives are true in their own kind. Walter Kaufmann described Nietzsche's views on Christianity and Christian love. Nietzsche repudiates that kind of neighbor love which is only man's bad love of himself. You flee to your neighbor from yourselves and would like to make a virtue of that. You cannot stand yourselves and do not love yourselves enough. The love of those who have not learned to stand solitude is not a virtue, but simply a weakness, nor do they profit their neighbors. Love is usually not unselfish. It is often the escape of two immature persons, neither of whom has learned to be alone or to make something of himself. Love, however, can be fruitful if two persons strive together to perfect themselves and each other. Such a relationship seems to Nietzsche the highest possible relationship between two human beings. To be sure, if a friend whom one loves in this manner should suffer, one will suffer with him. Nietzsche said, if you have a suffering friend, be a resting place for his suffering, but a hard bed, as it were. Thus will you profit him best. And if a friend wrongs you, then say, I forgive you what you did to me, but that you have done it to yourself, how could I forgive that? Some Nietzsche is painful, but some helpful. I now think it was my ego that was attracted to Christian heaven. Here it found a way of life after death. It usurped my soul. For me, symbols, e.g. of the church, now have next to no meaning. Now, music is often my preferred language for hearing about the divine. For example, in the enormous symphonies of Bruckner. Others have other valid languages. Nietzsche helped me by showing that the spiritual life is natural. I had previously thought this, now I felt this. On this, Walter Kaufmann comments, Nietzsche rejected the premise that spirit came into the world in a supernatural way, and that a Christian god or a devil was responsible for its intrusion into nature. He asserted that the spirit cuts. He asserted that the spirit cuts into life, and that it is its function to counteract man's tendency to yield to his impulses. He considered it an instrument used by life in its effort to enhance itself. Spirit is not opposed to life altogether, but directed only against one level of it. Its mission is not to destroy, but to perfect man's nature. I no longer found Christianity the way. At first, this was the equivalent of being lost in the biblical desert, though I felt it in outer space. Nietzsche writes of his experience that suffering of this sort is necessary before we can experience joy. Now I experience the spiritual life as being as straightforward as breathing. No mystification is necessary to experience it. Excuse me. I am now content to live and die without a belief in an afterlife. Back to my language, music. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is this. Fate knocks on the door. In the interest of truth we seek. Joy is found. What about Quakers, the future, and me? Quakerism lays importance on truth. It emphasizes that it is ultimately beyond the human ken. Recall Isaac Pennington. This is close to Nietzsche's perspectivism. George Fox said we should live experimentally. I think for modern Quakers, that should include taking on board Nietzsche's experiences and writings. In particular, we know that no one perspective or tradition claims the entire truth. The chief rabbi said as much, I understand, in the around 20 years ago. Can Quakers call on the Christian churches to say as much? Then we can say to Muslims that we do not claim the truth, and nor should they. Two things I learned from Nietzsche. The perspectival outlook. The old Quaker idea is central to a modern philosophical outlook. That the spiritual is part of our nature. It is not something that Christianity created. Excuse me, friends. That is the talk I gave nearly 20 years ago. So some of those things are thoughts I had at the time. I might not put them quite like that now. And I'll go on to say some observations, really. There might be a bit of repetition. 20 years is a significant time. A lot has happened since I gave this talk to Quakers in Walthamstow. Friends there agreed to me using the place. I had advertised it in The Friend, and around 20 were present, most being from other parts of London. In 20 years, a lot has happened to the way we look at things. When younger, I was one of many looking at alternatives, other ways in which humanity can arrange things. This was instead of Marxism, a practical practice, not a load of theory, and a theory that had led nations into intolerance and not infrequently mass murder. So two of Nietzsche's ideas seemed important to me 20 years ago. Theologically, I had been a follower of Jesus as a non-violent model, but I had lost my faith. I dreamt I was in outer space looking back at beautiful planet Earth, wishing I could be back there. One day I went to a large bookshop in London. I thought I might find something useful on the shelves marked philosophy. I was surprised to find far more books by one author rather than any other philosopher, Nietzsche. I purchased a book entitled What Nietzsche Really Said. My wife Heather and our lodger John were appalled. The one that the spirit cuts into life, coming from a notable philosopher no longer in the Christian fold, this seemed important. The other, I was taken by alternative ways of interpreting our existence or reality. I thought of these as different perspectives of the same mountain, but only one perspective at a time was possible. As a young Quaker activist, I had advocated alternative ways exemplifying social change as key parts of non-violent action. But in the last 17 years, much has changed. Alternative is becoming a tricky word. We have had a US president and others talking about alternative facts. Was I dangerous to advocate alternatives in my youth? A bit more about Nietzsche. His parents were in the Lutheran tradition in Germany. He was made professor of philology, the study of ancient documents, at Basel, age 24, before he had even passed his doctorate. Excuse me a moment. I can hear footsteps. Sorry, I can hear I've got it there. Excuse me, friends. That's one. Dr. Hillary's brought something. Hang on. Thank you. I've got one in my pocket. In the Franco-German War, Nietzsche served as an ambulance man. He sustained some medical injury or ailment which affected him thereafter and led to him to leave the academic world, and he often experienced pain. He never went back to Germany, but lived alone in rented rooms in Italy and Switzerland. Around 1880, he suddenly broke on the world, his dozen or so books being published within a few years. Even in translation, his writing style often sounds like someone speaking today. Many have provocative titles, some outrageously so. Human, all too human. Beyond good and evil. Twilight of the Idols. The Antichrist. Ecce Homo. And most famous of all, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In one of the books called The Gay Science, a madman announces that God is dead. I can read that possibly later. Thus Spake Zarathustra came later. This has a strong element of lampooning of sacred texts, though many ideas are vivid. Not really understanding it in World War I, the Kaiser said all German soldiers should carry a copy into battle together with a New Testament. in a clipped phrase, what is Nietzsche's philosophy? Humanity is on a tightrope. Humanity is on a tightrope between an animal state and a Superman state. Nietzsche feared that Germany was capable Nietzsche feared what Germany was capable of. He left Germany never to return, living mainly in Italy. He was highly skeptical of Christianity, but not of Jesus. Also of some ways of thinking, questioning, for instance, pity. Nietzsche and Nazism. Nietzsche's great biographer, Walter Kaufmann, of Jewish extraction and professor of philosophy at Princeton in the 1950s, quotes a German professor of philosophy in the 1930s, hand-picking part phrases from Nietzsche. And hand-picking part phrases from Nietzsche to toady up to the Nazis once Hitler was in power. Kaufmann showed how this was done and that Nietzsche was no Nazi. However, one does still come across people whose courses in the 50s to the 70s included philosophy and who have been taught Nietzsche was a Nazi. Since the 1960s, things changed. Important European thinkers finding his explosive thinking important. Elizabeth, his sister, had married a Nazi. Sorry about this. Elizabeth, his sister, had married a Nazi, and they went to Patagonia to set up a Nazi state around 1880. It failed. Elizabeth remained a Nazi, and long after Friedrich's death, entertained Hitler. One day in Turin, he saw a cabman mistreating a horse. He went to the animal to protect it, holding himself round its neck. He then fell to the ground in a state of delirium. He stayed like this some time and was put up in a room nearby. His friends from Basel had to come for him. Eventually, Elizabeth, his Nazi sister, scooped him up and took him to her big house in Weimar. There she exhibited him to visitors keen to see the insane philosopher. Across a stage in a white nightshirt, he was told to walk, still with his handsome moustache. He died 10 years later in 1900, aged 56. I once went to the Nietzsche house in Weimar. I was there to see the Bauhaus, really. And I saw the sofa on which Elizabeth presumably entertained Hitler. Heather remained appalled. About Nietzsche's influence. Sigmund Freud reputedly said of Nietzsche something to this effect: that he showed more insight into human nature than any person ever had or likely ever would. That is my addendum talk, friends. I've got 2 references to books about Nietzsche, but there are many. And 2 days ago, I phoned up Patsy saying my voice might not hold out. Well, it nearly didn't, but I'm sorry about the spluttering. So, friends, you might want to try me on questions or comments.
Oh, so that was so interesting. I learned a great deal in the last half hour. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you won't suffer greatly from the effort of speaking. Thank you ever so much.
Yes, Hillary brought me my asthma puffer, and I've got another one. I'm just going to have a go with it.
Right, then. Jeffrey, in the pantheon of philosophers, where do you think Nietzsche would stand today?
Thank you for asking me that, Ray. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an engineer, as well as other things. But all I can say is, if you go to Waterstones, you'll find more of his books than practically any other philosopher, although Plato does pretty well. He was very controversial, obviously. I think since the 1950s and 60s, well, as I understand it, there's two types of philosophy: English philosophy and Western and other philosophy. But European philosophy, he's become more important to that because of the French philosophers and thinkers in the 1960s, Derrida and various other people have found him quite useful. But he certainly features in any history of philosophy.
So, Graham.
Can't hear somebody. If somebody is speaking, can't hear them.
No, Graham's trying to unmute himself, I think. There you go.
I took my headset off so that Valerie could hear Jeffrey from the little loudspeaker in the laptop. But to say something, I need my headset with this microphone close to the mouth. So I hope you can hear what I'm saying now.
Yes.
But if I plugged in that with the volume set at 99 or 100 for Valerie in the far corner of the room, then I would have been deafened. So it took a little time to get adjusted. Knowing very little about Nietzsche, I looked him up on an unreliable source, Wikipedia, and they suggest that Nietzsche's reputation was partly, at least, debased by the fact that his sister Elizabeth, who certainly was a Nazi sympathizer, a nationalistic extremist, and a supporter of fascist governance, was the executor for Nietzsche's papers, all his writing, and she selected from them those quotes out of context which supported her views, and the unbiased reading of Nietzsche's writings would have given a much less unfavorable impression of his association and his use by the Nazis later on. So I'm interested.
Well, some off-the-cuff comments. 6 or 7 of his books were published during his lifetime and are not especially controversial. But indeed, I understand what you say, Graham, and Elizabeth Nietzsche. The incomplete writings, she put them together into a book whose title I've forgotten. I try to remember it, but it was a lot included stuff about Superman. But Nietzsche never actually put all these together into one book. So for many years, there was a rather dubious version of his last book. But I think in recent years, other people have now written, prepared a copy that is not influenced by Elizabeth Nietzsche. And in fact, I think that's been a paperback in Britain only for about 3 or 4 years. So it just shows that current study can correct errors that were made in the past. And yes, Elizabeth Nietzsche was not very clever, but she was definitely a Nazi.
Could you recommend a book by Nietzsche that a beginner might start on?
Oh, well, I'll just disappear from screen and come back with 2 or 3. Just hold on a moment.
I didn't really want 2 or 3. I wanted 1.
Beginners.
I liked the sound of that one, what Nietzsche really said. I don't know if that is going to be one of the recommendations. Oh, I'm going to have to turn off my vision again. I'm sorry.
I think he wrote one called Man and Superman, but don't quote me on that though.
George Bernard Shaw had a play called
Okay,
Man
well,
Superman.
what Nietzsche really said, Robert Solomon and Kathleen Higgins. I can, if anybody wants to write down a long number, you can do. It's published by Schocken. I think this is an American publication, probably. So it may not be too easy to get at the moment. But what Nietzsche really said, Robert C. Solomon, Kathleen M. Higgins, Schocken Books, New York. You can get a thing called Portable Nietzsche. And
Carry him anywhere.
Walter Kaufmann's book is called Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist and Prophet, I think it is.
Abe Books has got a copy of What Nietzsche Really Said for £4.46.
Oh,
Oh.
don't all rush at once then.
I don't know if I'll get it first, but there's oh no, it's yeah.
There's a very recent biography of Nietzsche by a woman called Sue Prideaux. She's English and it's only about 4 years ago. The title is I Am Dynamite, which is a quotation, of course. Hilary?
I was interested in much of what you said, and we'll hope to come back to it at some point over the next month or so. But a long time ago, many years ago, I heard somebody say, it is natural in the heart of man to pray. And I think there is a spiritual aspect to most people, if not all people. And I think many people forget this and also, in a way, probably try to escape from it. Interestingly, at our Wednesday meeting this week, we had a discussion on bias because people at that meeting felt that social media is extremely biased. And in fact, whatever your view is, the media will try to enhance that view. Therefore, there cannot be a true meeting of minds on that system. And in a way, what you said this morning confirms that. I'm sure that much of Nietzsche's Nazism, which is not really there, came from his sister. I mean, after all, she did scoop him up and take him back to her house, even though she was clearly misguided and paraded him in a very cruel way. But obviously that idea stuck, and really people do take the simplest option they can, and that's why I think he has been tarred with that particular brush for far, far too many years. So that's all for me at the moment.
Well, just to go back to one of the 2 things I learned from him, this metaphor of the spirit cuts into life. This is really, it struck me extremely weird. How can something that cuts into life be a good thing? And yet somehow this strange metaphor has got great power, it seems to me. I mean, after all, human words are just the best ways we can manage to say things. And of course, anything much of about religion is what has been permitted, as it were, by the various churches. And but I still find it rather weird to think of something cutting into me, and then that is the spiritual. But in a way, it's a very sort of powerful metaphor. But many of Nietzsche's words were meant, he said them almost to shock people.
I was trying to remember when I'd read some Nietzsche. I think I read Also sprach Zarathustra, and of course I probably read it after the movie, 2001, which opens with Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra. So I probably sort of read it in a for rather prosaic reasons, and I remember finding it complex and not finding things that I could really latch onto myself. It was sort of like, this is over here and I don't relate directly to it. And I think that's the case with a lot of philosophers and me. People, there is huge variety in human thought, and some of it is interesting, some of it's challenging, some of it agrees. What do you do? I concluded at one point in my life that we make up a kit bag of things that are useful from what we've seen and what we've learned.
Well, of course, let's speak Zarathustra. There's a degree to which that is a lampoon of the holy book. So it's written in old language, and the translations into English are with a slightly biblical tone of voice. But none of his other writing is in an old form of language. And if friends would like, now my voice has recovered a little, I could read from the Gay Science about the madman. And this is Nietzsche direct translated, but he translates well. If friends would like to hear a page about the madman and what the madman said to people, I will do that right now.
Why not?
This is the madman.
Carry on, Jeffrey.
Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said. Then my time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars. And yet they have done it themselves. It has been related further that on the same day, the madman forced his way into several churches and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, what after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? So that was the madman.
This may be slight heresy, friends, but bits of that reminded me of George Fox in his early days, going into churches and being that way. As I say, man, maybe I'm being a heretic there, but
Well, I dare say various people thought George Fox was mad.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, I think Angela might have wanted to say something a while back.
Well, a while back, I don't know that it's relevant now. I was just going to say something along the lines, for my Christmas present, I got a couple of books by Alice Roberts, the archaeologist, and what she can tell about a human from bones that are over 2,000 years is just amazing. And she's a humanist, actually. And I would say, for me, at this moment, I'm humanist rather than Quaker. But her book wasn't about humanism. It was about reading bones and what you can learn about bones. And it was a whole, I know nothing about bones, but it is totally, utterly, and completely amazing. So this is a tangent. Sorry about the tangent, folks, but I've been enthralled by her books.
I was trying to make a connection there and thinking that you were perhaps going to tell us something about what you could deduce about Nietzsche from his bone structure, but you
No, she's a scientist and she is just, her programs are very, very interesting. Yeah. She's on television sometimes. I don't know if she's got anything. She tends to be repeated on BBC 4, I think. But she'd look at a site and be able to pick up this tiny piece of pottery and say, oh, yes, that's the Vikings, or this and the other. And because I know nothing about it, and because of her books she writes so well and so down to earth, it's just enthralling.
I've seen Alice on telly, and very impressed by her. And of course, the archaeologists are finding things from, sometimes it's 1,500 years ago, sometimes it's 5,000 years ago, or 4,000 anyway. And we recently were, well, I have been to Orkney on 2 occasions, and they are unearthing walls built 4,000 years ago, and that are as fine as any wall that was built 400 years ago.
Yeah, and a system of writing or recording things in Orkney.
Well, the thing about it is, one wonders, this is from a time before Christianity. Yeah. And so how did people think of the world and existence? Well, they had all kinds of other ways of doing it, mythical beliefs that helped them in a sense, but they were, in a way, it just shows that when Jesus came, Jesus was offering well, I was almost going to say a more modern way of looking at things, but of course we've got so used to being in a culture that's Christian, it's impossible to think of anything else in a sense. So it's always useful to have archaeologists to remind us that before Jesus walked in our green and present land, other things happened.
You only have to go to Stonehenge actually and see what knowledge and understanding the builders of Stonehenge had about how, where sunrise would be on the shortest day of the year, which is pretty amazing, really.
Have you done that, Angela?
They didn't read it from books.
Have you done that, Angela?
What, go to Stonehenge? No. I
not at the solstice.
No, not in the solstice. I mean, it's on television and it's fascinating because there are some people with. I did once work at UWE with someone who was a pagan, and I didn't have to sit too long with him to hear beliefs that they weren't relevant to me, but they had a completely different, he and his partner had a completely different belief system from Christianity. And I think paganism and Stonehenge came into it. It was very coherent, but when you're having coffee and you're trying to think about the students you're about to meet in an hour, you're not actually very interested in that philosophy. But there are many philosophers and philosophies. I think we're particularly lucky, I think, in the Southwest, where we've got Wales and Celtic beliefs, and we've got the Southwest and so on. I feel very privileged to live here.
I had, I suppose, an experience along those lines when a number of us went to Glastonbury tour on the summer solstice, and that was quite something else, man. It's really amazing.
Well, one of the things that led me to offer this talk and bill it as the talk I gave nearly 20 years ago was the idea of alternative facts, which the President of the United States has come up with, you see, and people, can there be alternative facts? Well, in a court of law, they can't there wouldn't be. If you're charged with something, were you speeding or were you not? They could work it out. Did you do something that you shouldn't have done? In many cases, they work it out, and a jury or somebody will do this. So, in a way, it seems to me the idea of alternative facts is what a kind of rather half-baked person can make of the idea of alternatives, which 30 years ago we tried to bring forward as ways of exemplifying how the world could be better. So eventually somebody comes along and says, in that case, we'll have alternative facts, and and I'm applying the following. I'm applying facts as I think should exist, and it's away from reality. So in one sense, that's the subtlety is that I wouldn't really give my talk again unless I put it in this context. And so in case I hadn't made that context clear, I just sort of said it again now. Hilary, see your hand?
I'm just going to strangely say something about ex-President Trump, although I understand he's still a president forever. Recently, I have obtained a book called Fire and Fury from the British Heart Foundation. I wouldn't have paid £20 for it or more, but I was prepared to pay £2 for it. And I looked into it with amazement. There's somebody called Michael Wolff, who is apparently a good writer in the past. And the first 2 pages of how this book came to be written are certainly worth reading. And as I read this, I see that really what President Trump wants is to be loved. And I guess that's a fairly fundamental need of everybody. It's obviously an absolutely ghastly book further on, but well written, and as I say, worth dipping into. I could lend it to anybody who might be interested. And the thought that he might have a comeback is absolutely dreadful. But there we are. It's called Fire and Fury. And certainly the first pages of explaining how he had an open door policy and felt this was right. And therefore the door to the Oval Office was usually open. That is where, of course, they held and do hold important meetings. So that, in fact, if there was any closed door meetings to the Oval Office, this was very, very significant. These things are quite extraordinary. And Michael Wolff does explain, I would imagine he's no friend of Trump's now, but he does explain the fundamental wish of our president to be loved.
Well, my comment is that many people might hope to be loved, but they avoid getting themselves into the post of President of the United States.
Certainly true.
While we're on presidents of the United States and things like this, here's a book. I'll put it up front, and if you can't read the title, I shall read it for you.
An angel directs the storm.
Oh, oh.
But this is a book about that person. We all recognize him, no doubt.
Mhm.
It's George W.
W.
George W. Bush, and his he was enthralled by the American right-wing Christian groups, and they have a philosophy which, quite honestly, friends, scares me. And that's kind of philosophical in that sense. A bit far from Nietzsche, maybe, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm thinking how we have strayed a long way from received wisdom, and you know, the way that for long periods of time people were basically required to hold their hand up and attest to what they believed, and you could be you could find yourself strapped to a stake with flames licking at your feet if you weren't prepared to sign up for that. And Nietzsche, the alternative is freedom of thought and speech, but that ends up being a bit chaotic. Is there one thing that struck me, or I was thinking as you were talking, Jeffrey, was the state of mind of people in, writing books. The madman is obviously, he may well be in some kind of religious ecstasy, or he may be in a crazed state, and perhaps you're invited to try and figure out which is which. Quite clearly, the world is still going on while somebody is ranting and screaming in front of others. And when one reads, I'm thinking of William James's varieties of, is it religious or mystical experience? And the wise, those who have deeper perception, are said not to be able to maintain a level of equanimity in the face of positivity or negativity, and not to confuse the ignorant. And some people seem to take a delight in stirring things up without necessarily helping people move forward. My mind plays around with these things, but I come back to looking for things that help people achieve their full potential, which I think includes mystical experience of oneself in states of harmony and union with the universe and the spirit behind the universe. And there are emerging philosophies now and sciences suggesting that consciousness itself is the underlying reality, and then you can ascribe anything you like to that spirit or whatever. But if we're able to tune into that, then we're also tuning into each other at a level. And yeah, so I'm interested in what philosophers come up with, and economists come up with, and politicians come up with. But the underlying reality for a lot of people is a recognition that we're all united on a planet, and should find ways of living together harmoniously and without greed, which seems to speak to the idea of finding satisfaction within rather than scraping around for it on the outside.
Friends, it has come to that hour. Graham.
If you're willing, I'd just like to read a paragraph to you. No connection at all with Nietzsche. May I do that?
Do.
Right. Well, this refers back to the talk I gave about Hilda Cashmore last week. It's a paragraph from Helen Meller's biography of her, and refers to the building next door to Central Meeting House, which is something like Champion Square Flats now. And Helen Meller includes this in the book because it's a story of what Friar's Friends were doing for impoverished people of the area well over 100 years ago. I knew that that building contains the original Quaker workhouse of about 1698, and has been extended, of course, and adapted since then. The word workhouse is inappropriate because it was much nearer to a business selling material which the residents of the place had woven on looms. So it wasn't just the traditional form of workhouse, a place you go in order to die. It was elderly Quakers working at looms, producing cloth, which was advertised and sold. and Chris Wilmore looked into this. That went on until something like middle to late 19th century. And then the building became the center for Quaker social work in the area, which of course Helen Mellor includes in her biography of Hilda Cashmore as being a kind of prelude to the creation of the university settlement, which continued that work. And she writes, the focus of Quaker social work in the city throughout the 19th century had been the Quaker mission in the city centre. Initially a religious mission, in the 1860s, the Quakers did something remarkable. A deeply spiritual, serious-minded sect. I don't think Helen is a Quaker or has much knowledge of Quakers, but she describes us as a spiritual, serious-minded sect. They yet decided to be the first in the city to take part in new developments in socio-religious work that went against their culture. They transformed their city mission into a community centre, ceasing to mainstream attempts to convert the populace. The Quakers owned a building in New Street, St. Jude's, that had been used to support indigent Quaker weavers in 1696. In 1865, they made it into a meeting place for local people where they could come not only for friendship, advice, comfort, and support, but also free entertainment as a means of attracting them to come. The idea was to connect with the people and to befriend them. Young Quakers began offering entertainments of music, songs, readings, and poetry, which they performed themselves. Regular penny readings on Wednesday evenings were organized, joining the penny readings movement that was spreading quickly across the country. There were social activities for mothers and children and adult education for men. The most unusual aspects of their endeavors was that they did this not in any respectable suburb, but in the city center amongst the poorest citizens. Quaker women played a large part in sustaining this initiative. Amongst them were the then young Sturge sisters, all 6 of them, including Elizabeth Sturge, who, as has been noted, was to help decades later in the creation of the university settlement. Now that was presumably about the last 3 decades of the 19th century, and I was quite unaware of this social activity. It closed down eventually because, of course, there were many other forms of entertainment which people could go to. So it lost support, but I felt that those of you, most of you, attached to Central Meeting ought to know that little bit of the history of your meeting. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Jeffrey can give a Nietzschean perspective on that. To wrap us
Well, of
up.
course, just in brief, I'm aware that Quakers throughout Britain were doing things, not innovative things in those days. In London, there was the Bedford Institute Association did that and had 7 or 8 buildings all around London doing things of adult education. And of course, there became an adult school movement. And when I first went to my first meeting in 1969, the General Secretary of the Adult School Movement went to this meeting in London. But I think they laid themselves down before the 1970s were out.
Angela.
Yeah, and this is an aside, but I'm just thinking there have been movements to close Central Meeting Library, And I do seem to remember that it was a Quaker that actually designed and largely paid for that building. So it is very special. And long may it stay there, even though it's, you know, it's creaking. It's a bit old now, but I'm pretty sure it's quite interesting because it's next door to the cathedral. So it's well sited.
Could you clarify which building you mean next? I think you're talking about a central meeting house, but we're not next to the cathedral.
I'm talking about the central library.
Central
Oh,
library.
yes. Yes.
Central library that was designed and I understand largely paid for by a Quaker or by Quakers. And of course, you know, when you have a library, you have access to any book that's, in theory, that's been published in this country. You can reserve it and borrow it. So it's access to speaking truth to power, shooting truth, finding things are wrong, whatever. But that seems to me to be a pretty central part of Bristol, that library building.
Cheap access to knowledge, dangerous stuff, you know. Anyway, friends, next week we have the infatigable David Saunders, who is going to speak to us on age of energy abundance could be closer than we think.
Or something like that.
Interesting.
Oh, let's hope.
Okay, then, folks. And as Ronnie Parker said to Ronnie Corbett, and it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.